So I want to start with a brief passage from the Gospel according to Matthew, but not the passage about Jesus' birth. This is from Matthew chapter 5, verse 14 to 16, and this is part of what is typically known as the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus is speaking to the people gathered there, and he says to them, "You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven." Tomorrow morning, as we've heard from the prelude and the song just now, is the solstice. Tomorrow morning at 10:59 a.m., the wheel of the year will turn once again as we welcome the winter solstice, marking both the shortest day of the year and the longest night of the year. And I don't know about you, but for me, these short days are a real drag. You know what it's like. For many people, it's you wake up in the dark and go to work in the dark. And then after work, you come home in the dark. Even if you really don't have to work any longer, unless you're a late sleeper, it's darker than usual when you wake up, and it's already dark by 4:30 or so. You know, I get confused now because my late afternoons are centered around 7 o'clock is Jeopardy. Don't bother me at 7 o'clock. But I'm so used to being at light at 7 o'clock that I'm still confused with the dark. It's already dark by the time Jeopardy is on. So that's how I measure time. Kind of strange, but that's me. But the good news is that starting tomorrow, the days will begin to get longer, almost imperceptibly at first. You won't notice it right away because it kind of sneaks up on you, right? And at some point, you'll say, "Oh, it's 6 a.m. and the sun is up already." I'm waiting for those days. I'm looking forward to those days. And this has been happening on our planet since it was first formed after the Big Bang and began its orbit around the sun. And since plants and trees and animals first appeared, they have instinctually responded to those subtle changes that the winter solstice brings. And when humans appeared, they quickly learned to respond to those changes of the solstice too, and the equinoxes too that happen. Whether hunter or gatherer or farmers, they learned to read these signs and to adapt to the changing conditions, knowing when the best time and place for hunting was, and when the best time was for sowing and reaping their crops. But they also learned to pay attention to those subtle changes in the light and in the position of the stars. Our ancestors hoped for the light to return on the solstice. Some of them, the ones who'd been around a while, they had something else too, apart from hope. They had faith. Faith because they had seen this annual return of the light during their lives. They knew what happened every year at the same time. So they could say with assurance to those younger people who had come after them, "Hey, it'll be okay. The light will return, things will get brighter and better." They had faith and they had hope. Today, we know for certain that faith and hope wasn't misplaced. The light does return each year. We know that this has nothing to do with gods or with miracles. It's a scientific fact that's been proven over and over again, and it's true. It's been proven down through the ages. But for them, they had to have not only faith, but they had to have that hope, right? And the idea of faith and hope are fraught with all sorts of, those are both loaded words. And maybe in the future, there's a sermon in there too about the difference. But they had to have hope that the sun god would, in fact, return again as he did each year and not fail them. Hope that the miracle would once again happen, that life would continue. Hope that the light would again help them to warm their homes and to warm their fields and the crops they planted, to warm their bodies. And they developed all sorts of things to do to help that light return, all sorts of rituals and things. That's what Yule is about. If you've ever seen, I think I did a couple of years ago, I think I told you the story from the TV show, the children's TV show a number of years ago, Fraggle Rock. I don't know if any of you remember Fraggle Rock when your children were young. I love Fraggle Rock. But the best one, I thought, was the story of the annual sounding of the bell, the great bell. It happened at what was really the solstice. And they all got together, the little Fraggles, and they rang their bells every year, and they danced around and had a good time. And ringing the bells then had the effect of having the great bell sound and the winter leaving and the sun returning. And one Fraggle didn't really believe it so much, and he had to go find the great bell. And if you remember the story, when he got there, he saw that there really was no real bell at all. And so he thought the whole thing was a fake. And then he got back and he found that his friends had frozen solid. And he had to have faith by ringing a bell that the great bell would ring, and they unfroze. So they had this ritual. Well, that's like our ancestors. Our ancestors did the same thing. They developed these rituals to encourage themselves. And I imagine those ancients sitting around a fire in their huts or their caves, huddled together to keep warm. And I imagine the children who, like many of the adults, I'm sure, were afraid of the dark and the long nights, asking one of those elders, maybe he was a shaman, maybe she was a wise woman, I don't know, tell us again, are you sure that the light will return? Will things be all right again? Tell us the story about the sun god's return. And the elder sat there responding, saying, yes, things will be all right. The light of the sun will return as it always does. We've lived through the darkness many times before, and light always returns. You just have to have faith and hold on to hope. In their own way, our ancestors were celebrating Advent. They were in a period of expectancy, a period of waiting. And as I've been saying the past few weeks, they were observing Advent the way we should be observing it, actively. They weren't just sitting around. They did what they needed to do to prepare and to get through the dark, cold nights. They had faith in the return of the light because it was, as our reading said earlier, it was evidence-based. It had returned every year. Now, this wasn't to say that they had no fear or they weren't afraid. I mean, they didn't really understand, right, the science behind what happened every year. They didn't know anything about axial tilt and all that stuff. And so they told stories about what they thought was happening. And those myths, those stories developed in every culture around the world in different ways. Some of those stories were about the conquest of light over darkness, in which light represented good and darkness represented evil. But many of the more ancient ones are stories about the goddesses and gods who controlled the elements and the weather. When the end of the longest night, the dark is defeated with the return of the sun and the return of the light and hope and promise. The goddess gives birth to the sun god. The sun begins to stay out longer, days are longer, and the days grow longer, and hidden things begin to emerge. The darkness is dissipated. And Northern Europeans believed that the Holly King ruled over the year, from midsummer to Yule. And at Yule, he surrenders to the light of the Oak King, his twin, who rules from Yule to midsummer. And both fight for the attention of the earth goddess, and each of them surrenders their life force for the well-being of the land and the people. And these myths and many others from around the world were shared and adapted over the millennia. So we find those stories of the birth of the sun god or the divine culture, a divine child in all cultures. We find it in ancient Egypt, we find it in ancient India, China, all over. The stories of the birth of Jesus are no exception. And I know it's easy for us as people of a liberal faith who place great importance, rightly so, on the use of reason, to dismiss these stories as childish, as superstitious. And in some ways they are. There's a childlike quality to them, and they are based on age-old superstitions, many of them. And some people, even in our allegedly tolerant tradition, become really worked up over this, and they take it upon themselves to tell the world that it's all a myth. I recall a number of years ago, there was a large billboard that was erected on the ellipse. If you've ever driven into New York or taken the bus into New York, into the Lincoln Tunnel, you go around that big ellipse into the tunnel in Weehawken there. And there was a large billboard that was erected around the holiday season. And it showed a picture of the star and the nativity scene and all, but in big bold letters next to it, it said, "It's all a myth." And that was erected by, I forget what organization. It may have been the Atheists of America. I don't know who it was. And I remember seeing that sign and saying to myself, yeah, it is all a myth, but was that really necessary? You can do it. That's your freedom to do that. But freedom doesn't necessarily mean you have to do it or should do it. Personally, I found that billboard mean-spirited and crass. And it was unnecessary because I see the value in the myth. And for me, the value in the story of Advent and the birth of Jesus is that it calls us to recognize our own divinity, to recognize that what Jesus said in Matthew 5:14-16 that I read at the beginning, you are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people put a light or light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others. That's the basis of our liberal religious faith. And sometimes living out that faith can be frightening. Now, we all know that tomorrow morning, the solstice is going to happen, right? And that the light will return. We have evidence-based factual faith in that. And yet, in our day-to-day lives, we face dark times. And very often we're tempted to believe that things won't get better, that the light won't shine again. Perhaps it's something happening in our own lives. I could probably recite a whole litany of terrible things, and you might say to yourselves, yes, that's happening to me. And I'm afraid these things will never get better. Now, I'm not one of those people who like to say, oh, of course they will. Because in reality, for some people, for many people, and for many people around the world in different parts of the world that we don't even experience ever, things don't get better. That's just reality. I'm not being Pollyanna-ish about this. But that's a different topic again for a different sermon, maybe. Or just look around at what's happening in our nation, right? These are dark, perilous times. And honestly, every day I run the gamut of emotions about it, from being fearful that the already fragile democracy we've had in the past that we all grew up with is going to be completely destroyed, to thinking, no, things will be okay. The people will do the right thing. The Constitution will hold. Those institutions that we depend on will hold. And if there was a if I could print it out, it would look like this, the way I go every day. I'm sure you're all going through the same thing. And I try to remember that we are called to bring light, but we can't do that unless we also offer hope. You know, there's some interesting words in the Christian scriptures about this in the letter to Hebrews, to the Hebrews. The scholars aren't certain who wrote that letter, but they are certain that it wasn't Paul, who wrote a lot of letters, apparently, that are in the Christian scriptures. But it's traditionally believed that he wrote it. They don't believe that, the scholars. The author, though, is trying to write to a group of Jewish followers, the first followers of Jesus, and to encourage them in their faith. In chapter 10, he says this: remember those earlier days after you had received the light, after they had seen and recognized Jesus as their Messiah. Remember those earlier days after you had received the light, when you endured in a great conflict full of suffering. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times, you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions. So don't throw away your confidence. It will be richly rewarded. You need to persevere, he says to them, so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what has been promised. For, and he quotes here from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew scriptures, in just a little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay. Advent. And he says, but my righteous one, says the Hebrew scriptures, will live by faith. And I take no pleasure in the one who shrinks back. Then he goes on to say, but we do not belong to those who shrink back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith. And he goes on in chapter 11 to say what may be a verse that's familiar to some of you. Now, faith is the confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. The more familiar King James translation for some of you is, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, for by it the elders obtained a good report. Those ancient ancestors I spoke about earlier, like the Jewish ancestors the writer of Hebrews is referring to, are commended for having the faith they had because they had evidence-based faith. They'd seen the truth that things can get better, even as they'd gone through difficult times. The writer of Hebrews reminds his readers that as the earliest followers of Jesus, people who had received the light of what they already faced. He said, you were treated badly, you were persecuted, sometimes you lost your property. But you knew you had better possessions. You knew you had something better, that things could be better. Now, some of us here have had that happen as we try to be a light to the world, right? A light in the darkness. I know that many of you here have experienced being insulted when you stood side by side with others who were being persecuted, that you were, as we say, standing on the side of love. Many of us remember our days when we perhaps marched in protests and other people were shouting at the side, on the sidelines, yelling at us, calling us names, maybe even hitting us or throwing things at us. And I know that many of you, even now, are engaged in standing with those who are wrongfully imprisoned, that you're standing with our immigrant sisters and brothers, with our LGBTQI friends and relatives, women who are faced with the loss of their human rights and control over their own bodies, with those who are homeless and hungry and jobless. This is doing what Jesus of Nazareth said we're all called to do and to be, light to the world. And at times it seems that our lights have gone out or are struggling to continue to shine. But with compassion and love we can take the lessons of Advent and the solstice to heart and remind ourselves and each other that we have evidence-based faith that the light does indeed return. We can offer hope to the world and strengthen other people's faith. That's not easy to do, but that's what we're called to do. The Gospel of John says this. It says, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Things are dark right now, yes. But we know that the light will return. Things will get better. This is the foundation of our liberal religious tradition. This is what our faith is about. This is our Advent message. So keep the faith. Keep Adventing. May it be so.
If you enjoyed this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video.